Hello, and welcome back to Forgotten Women in History. This is the channel where we uncover the stories of remarkable women that history almost let slip through the cracks. Women who changed the world, yet rarely made it into the textbooks. Every story here is thoroughly researched and fact-checked, but told with all the emotion and meaning these women deserve. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing, and if you enjoy today's story, a like would mean the world. Now, let's begin. Reims in the 1780s, a city of contrasts and ancient traditions. Here, in the city's magnificent cathedral, French kings had been crowned for centuries. And here, in the narrow streets of the merchants' quarter, the fortunes of a new class, the bourgeoisie, were being forged. It was into just such a family that on December 16, 1777, a girl was born and christened Barbe-Nicole. Her father, Nicolas Ponsardin, was one of the wealthiest textile magnates in the region. He manufactured wool cloth, traded across Europe, and knew the value of every franc down to the last centime. The Ponsardin household was a temple of order and calculation. Unlike aristocratic families, where children were raised by governesses and nannies, this house had a distinctly business-like atmosphere. Dinner table conversation revolved around raw material prices, supplier reliability, and fluctuations in demand for various grades of cloth. Little Barbe-Nicole absorbed these lessons without even realizing their value. She watched her father negotiate deals, watched her mother run the household with the precision of an army quartermaster. In this family, money was never something shameful. It was a tool, one to be respected and made to grow. But Barbe-Nicole's childhood coincided with an era when the very ground seemed to shake beneath people's feet. 1789, she is 12 years old, Paris is engulfed in the flames of revolution. The Bastille has fallen. Crowds in the streets demand the blood of aristocrats. Slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity echo across France. And the Ponsardin family, like thousands of other bourgeois families, finds itself facing a choice. Whose side are you on? A wrong answer could cost you your head. Quite literally. Nicolas Ponsardin displayed a quality his daughter would inherit in full measure: pragmatic flexibility. He was neither a fiery revolutionary nor a secret royalist. He was a businessman who wanted to survive and preserve his fortune. When it was called for, he wore the tricolor cockade and donated to the cause of the revolution. When the political winds shifted, he found ways to remain useful to whatever power held sway. This ability to read the political climate and adapt to it would become one of Barbe-Nicole's greatest talents in the years to come. The years of the terror left a deep mark on the teenage girl's mind. She watched yesterday's neighbors vanish in the night. She heard stories of the guillotine working without pause in the squares of Paris. She understood that wealth could become a death sentence if one didn't know how to conceal it. But the greatest lesson was a different one. The world is unjust and unpredictable, and is not the strongest or the richest who survives, but the one who adapts fastest to change. That lesson she would remember for the rest of her life. By the mid-1790s, the revolutionary chaos began to subside. The Directory tried to restore order, trade revived, and the Ponsardin family once again prospered. It was then that Nicolas began thinking about his daughter's marriage. Barbe-Nicole was about 20, the age at which a young woman from a respectable family was expected to marry. But her father had no intention of giving his daughter to just anyone. The marriage was meant to strengthen the family's business standing. The chosen groom was Veuve Clicquot, son of Philippe Clicquot Moiron, a banker and owner of a trading house founded back in 1772, which also dealt, among other things, in wine. It was a union of two fortunes, textiles and wine, romance. It was hardly the primary criterion in such arrangements. But fate had other plans. Barbe-Nicole and Franc genuinely fell in love. Franc Clicquot was a dreamer. Unlike his calculating banker father, he dreamed of vineyards and cellars. He believed Champagne could become more than a regional curiosity, a symbol of luxury for all of Europe. His passion proved contagious. After their wedding in 1798, the young wife began accompanying her husband on his trips through the vineyards of Champagne. And here a trait emerged that scandalized local society. Barbe-Nicole didn't merely accompany him, she participated. Imagine the reaction of the winemakers when a young lady in an expensive gown descended into cold cellars where the temperature held at around 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees F year-round, touching bottles coated in mold, asking pointed questions about fermentation. For a woman of her station, this was almost indecent. Ladies were supposed to know exactly one thing about wine, how to hold a glass elegantly. But Barbe-Nicole couldn't have cared less about propriety. She discovered that the world of winemaking captured her imagination in a way embroidery or music never had. She learned to distinguish grape varieties, Pinot Noir with its depth, Chardonnay with its elegance, Pinot Meunier with its fruitiness. She came to understand how weather shaped a harvest. She studied the mysterious process by which sweet juice transforms into sparkling wine. A daughter, Clémentine, was born to the couple. Life, it seemed, was falling perfectly into place. But fate was preparing a blow. Franc Clicquot was never in robust health. He suffered from bouts of melancholy that a modern doctor would likely diagnose as severe depression. By 1804, his condition had deteriorated sharply. In October 1805, he died, most likely of typhoid fever. He was only 30 years old. Barbe-Nicole was left alone with a 6-year-old daughter, an unprofitable business, and a dream her husband never lived to fulfill. But she was no helpless widow out of a novel. Behind her stood a childhood in a household where money was counted with respect and precision. A youth spent in an age of revolution that had taught her to survive under any regime. Years in the cellars of Champagne that had given her knowledge no other woman of her class possessed. And, above all, she had inherited from her father that same pragmatic flexibility, the ability to adapt and to win. Now those qualities would face their ultimate test, because the Champagne she was about to sell was far from perfect. To grasp the scale of what Barbe-Nicole Clicquot was about to accomplish, forget everything you know about modern Champagne. Forget the crystal, clear golden liquid in elegant flutes, the perfect chains of rising bubbles, the image of flawless luxury inseparably tied to the word today. Champagne at the dawn of the 19th century was an entirely different product, temperamental, unpredictable, and, frankly, rather unpleasant to look at. Picture a bottle just pulled from a dark cellar. You hold it up to the light and see a cloudy liquid the color of stale apple juice. Sediment swirls at the bottom, looking uncomfortably like clumps of wet semolina. When you pour it into a glass, a good deal of that murk inevitably comes along with it. The taste was a gamble. It might be delightful, or it might taste like raw dough. This was the wine produced by every house in Champagne, including the most prestigious. The trouble lay in the very nature of sparkling wine. Unlike still wines, Champagne undergoes two fermentations. The first turns grape juice into a young wine, The second, the interesting part, happens right inside the bottle once a bit of sugar and yeast has been added. The yeast consumes the sugar and releases carbon dioxide, which dissolves into the wine and creates those magical bubbles. But there's a catch. Once its work is done, the yeast dies and settles on the inside of the bottle as an unappetizing sediment. Getting rid of that sediment was considered impossible, or so the winemakers of the time believed. One could decant the wine into another bottle, but doing so released most of the carbon dioxide, defeating the whole purpose. Champagne without bubbles is just white wine, and not even particularly good white wine. So producers resigned themselves to sediment as a necessary evil. Some even claimed the cloudiness gave the drink character. In reality, it simply marked it as a second-rate product. There was another way to deal with the sediment, decanting through skilled service. Wealthy clients employed servants trained to carefully pour champagne into a carafe, leaving all the murk behind in the bottle. It required real skill and patience, and the results remained unpredictable at best. Plus, the process wasted precious bubbles and often half the bottle. An elegant solution, more like an expensive workaround. But cloudiness was only one of the problems. The champagne of that era literally exploded. Pressure inside a bottle could reach roughly 6 atmospheres, about 3 times that of a car tire. Glass in those days was made unevenly, thick in some places, thin in others. The slightest flaw, and a bottle became a hand grenade. Cellar workers were killed. A chain reaction could wipe out an entire year's stock within minutes. One bottle would burst, shrapnel would pierce its neighbors, and those would explode too. Winemakers called champagne the devil's wine. Losses of 20, 30, sometimes 50% of an entire production run were common. It was a lunatic business. You laid your wine down in the cellar and prayed that even half the bottles would survive to be sold. Insurance companies refused to cover sparkling wine producers. Every batch was a gamble, staking months of labor and enormous sums of money. Under such conditions, champagne could never become a mass market drink. It remained an exotic curiosity, a plaything of the rich who could afford to pay triple for an unstable product. Its main market was France itself, and even there champagne lost out to the wines of Bordeaux and Burgundy. Reliable, predictable, well understood, champagne, by contrast, was like fireworks, spectacular, but dangerous and short-lived. Competition among the winemaking houses of Champagne was fierce, yet oddly self-defeating. Everyone fought over the same small market, all producing roughly the same mediocre product. The House of Moët, founded by Claude Moët back in 1743, was considered the industry leader. It had connections at the courts of Europe, well-established distribution, and decades of reputation behind it. Jean-Raé Moët, who took over the family business at the turn of the century, skillfully leveraged his close ties to Napoleon Bonaparte. The emperor was a family friend and regularly ordered their wine. Next to such giants, the House of Clicquot looked like a dwarf. The trading house founded by Veuve Clicquot, Muiron, back in 1772, had spent decades as a minor player. Wine was more of a side venture for it than a central business. It had none of Moat's connections, none of the old house's reputation, no particular market advantage. It produced the same cloudy wine as everyone else, and sold it with all the same problems. Small wonder that Barbe-Nicole's father-in-law considered the winemaking business a lost cause. But the young widow saw the picture differently. Years spent with her husband in the cellars and vineyards had taught her something essential. Every winemaking house in Champagne suffered from the same disease. Cloudiness wasn't the curse of a few unlucky producers. It was a systemic problem plaguing the entire industry. Whoever found the cure for that disease would gain an extraordinary competitive advantage. They would be able to sell something no one else had: clear, crystalline, perfect champagne. Barbe-Nicole understood something else important, too. The champagne market wasn't limited so much by wars or economics as by the quality of the product itself. People didn't buy more sparkling wine because it didn't deserve to be bought more. Improve the quality, and the market would grow. Create a flawless product, and it would generate its own demand. This was a revolutionary idea for an industry that had lived for centuries by the principle, everyone does it this way, so it must be right. In 1805, taking over the House of Clicquot, Barbe-Nicole knew her goal. She needed not merely to survive in a business dominated by men with a century of experience. She needed to achieve the impossible, to create champagne free of the curse of cloudiness. She had no idea how to do it. No one in the world knew the answer to that question, but she was prepared to search for it with a persistence many mistook for madness. The years that followed became a period of relentless experimentation. Barbe-Nicole spent her days in the cellars, watching how sediment behaved inside the bottles. She tried different clarification methods, different aging periods, different sealing techniques. Most experiments ended in failure, debts mounted, competitors snickered, and her father-in-law shook his head as he tallied the losses. But the widow Clicquot did not give up. Somewhere in the depths of those cold chalk caverns, among the endless rows of bottles, an answer lay hidden, and she was determined to find it. Sometime between roughly 1810 and 1816, after years of dogged searching, the solution was born in the cellars of the House of Clicquot in Reims. Here, some 60 feet underground, in labyrinths of chalk galleries first dug by the Romans, Barbe-Nicole spent most of her time. The temperature held steady year-round at around 10-12 degrees Celsius, 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls were coated in black mold that fed on wine vapors. Torches cast a flickering light across endless rows of bottles laid horizontally on wooden racks. The air smelled of damp, of yeast, of time itself. The widow Clicquot walked between the rows, studying the bottles, jotting notes in a small book. She was studying her enemy, that same sediment that turned potentially great wine into cloudy mediocrity, and she noticed a pattern others had either overlooked or simply ignored. The sediment did not cling permanently to the glass. It moved slowly, almost imperceptibly. Tilt a bottle, and the particles would begin sliding down under the pull of gravity. Very slowly, but they moved. This observation became the starting point for a great invention. The idea, like all great ideas, was simple. If the sediment could move, it could be made to gather in one spot. If you stood a bottle vertically, neck down, all the yeast particles would eventually collect at the cork. All that remained was to open the bottle quickly, let the sediment escape along with a small amount of wine, and reseal it. In theory, flawless. In practice, seemingly impossible. The first problem bottles couldn't simply be flipped upside down all at once. The sediment stuck to the glass walls, and an abrupt change of position wouldn't help. The particles would stay right where they were. What was needed was a gradual transition from horizontal to vertical, with the bottle regularly rotated so the sediment would loosen from the glass. That required time, weeks, sometimes months, and constant attention. The second problem, how do you hold thousands of bottles at just the right angle? The storage racks of the day were built for horizontal storage only. Realizing Barbe-Nicole's idea required fundamentally new equipment, and here an ordinary kitchen table enters the story. Destined to become the symbol of an innovation that would transform an entire industry. Legend has it that the widow Clicquot took a heavy oak table from her own kitchen and had carpenters drill angled holes into the tabletop. Just a handful at first. For experimentation, bottles were placed neck down into these holes. The table was propped up on trestles, so there was room beneath it for the bottle necks. Thus was born the prototype of the pupitre, a special rack for clarifying champagne still used to this day. The design was crude but functional. Each day, a worker would take hold of a bottle, give it a slight quarter, turn clockwise, and tilt it a bit further toward vertical. This process was repeated day after day for several weeks. Gradually, the bottle would reach a nearly upright position, and the sediment, disturbed by the regular turning, would slowly slide down toward the cork. Barbe-Nicole called this process remouage, from the French word meaning stirring or shaking. The name was ironic. The whole point of the method was precisely not to shake the wine, but to coax the sediment into gathering in one place. Still, the term stuck, and today remouage, or riddling, as it's known in English, remains the official term for this stage of champagne production the world over. The first experiments were makeshift and hands-on. Barbe-Nicole personally oversaw the process, adjusting angles, fine-tuning the frequency of turns. She discovered that different batches of wine behaved differently. Some cleared in 3 weeks, others needed 2 months. The consistency of the sediment depended on the grape variety, the vintage, the fermentation conditions. There was no universal formula. Every batch had to be managed individually. Once the sediment finally collected at the cork, the most delicate moment arrived: de-gorgement, disgorgement, the removal of the sediment. A worker would hold the bottle neck down, quickly pull the cork, and the internal pressure would eject the plug of sediment along with a small amount of wine. The bottle was then instantly turned upright, topped up with a bit of wine or liqueur to compensate for the loss, and resealed. All of this had to happen within a few seconds, or the precious carbon dioxide would be lost. The result exceeded every expectation. Champagne that had gone through remouage was crystal clear. It shone gold in the glass, danced with flawless bubbles, delighted the eye as much as the palate. This was wine on an entirely different level, no longer a cloudy peasant drink, but a beverage fit for kings. Barbe-Nicole had created a product that had never existed before, but she understood. Her advantage would last only as long as competitors failed to crack the secret. And cracking it wouldn't be hard. All it would take was a glimpse of the pupiters in the cellar or a loose-lipped worker's story. So the widow Clicquot instituted a regime of absolute secrecy. Workers swore oaths of silence. Outsiders were barred from the cellars on pain of immediate dismissal. The doors to the room housing the pupiters were locked behind several bolts. The handful who knew the secret of remouage were kept under constant watch. Barbe-Nicole paid them more than her competitors did, binding them to her financially. She knew each one by name, asked after their families, helped them through hard times. This was not charity, it was calculation. A loyal worker does not betray. The house of Clicquot became something like a closed order. Its central mystery, a leaky table in a chalk cellar. The secrecy worked. Competitors noticed that the widow Clicquot's champagne kept getting better, but couldn't understand why. Jean-Henri Maimot, head of the leading rival house, sent spies, who returned empty-handed. Rumors circulated about some special filtration method, about secret additives, even about sorcery. The truth was far more mundane and far more brilliant. A woman had learned to strike a deal with the laws of physics. The Rimwich technology gave the widow Clicquot a colossal advantage, but by itself it couldn't save the business. To make money, you have to sell, and selling required markets that, between roughly 1808 and 1810, remained firmly closed. The Napoleonic Wars had redrawn the map of Europe and severed its trade routes. Britain, the largest potential market, was the enemy. Russia alternated between war with France and alliance with it. The Clicquot warehouses filled with magnificent, crystal clear champagne that no one was left to buy. By 1813, the company was once again teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Barbe-Nicole had pulled off a technological revolution, but the war threatened to bury it and her together. What was needed now was something more than a winemaker's genius. What was needed was a gamble no sensible merchant would ever dare take, and the widow Clicquot was ready to risk everything. 1814, Europe is engulfed in a war now more than 20 years old. Napoleon Bonaparte, who only recently seemed unbeatable, suffers defeat after defeat. His Grande Armée perished in the snows of Russia 2 years earlier. Now a coalition of European powers is pressing the French on every front. Allied troops approach the borders of France. The end of the empire is near, but no one knows what shape that end will take or what will follow it. For Barbe-Nicole Clicquot, these were years of agonizing waiting. Her cellars overflowed with the finest champagne ever produced in Champagne. The Rimwich technique was working flawlessly. Every bottle shone with crystalline clarity. But there was no one to sell this splendor to. The continental blockade, imposed by Napoleon against Britain, had paralyzed maritime trade. Ports were closed, borders sealed off by armies. Merchants were afraid to risk cargo that could be confiscated at any moment. The debts of the House of Clicquot grew month by month. Production required money. Workers had to be paid. Grapes bought from local farmers, cellars maintained. There was almost no income. Barbe-Nicole sold off family valuables, mortgage property borrowed from anyone willing to lend. Her father-in-law, Philippe Clocot-Muron, retired from business by then, could only shake his head. He had warned her that the wine trade was a road to ruin, but the widow Clicquot had no intention of giving up. She analyzed the situation with the cold precision of a stock speculator. War could not last forever. Sooner or later peace would come, and the markets would reopen. The question was who would reach the customers first. Whoever managed to deliver goods ahead of the competition would skim the cream off the top. Everyone else would be left with scraps. Russia, in the widow's judgment, was the most promising market of all. Russian officers and aristocrats had a genuine passion for champagne. They drank it at balls, celebrated victories with it, drowned the tedium of long winter evenings in it. Before the war, the House of Clicquot had already been shipping wine to St. Petersburg and Moscow. Clients were pleased, and orders were growing. Then the war began, and everything collapsed. Now Russia was allied with the coalition against Napoleon, which made it, by definition, an enemy of France. Selling goods to the enemy during wartime amounted to treason. Such a thing could get a person shot. But Barbe-Nicole understood something crucial. Waiting for an official peace meant missing the moment entirely. The instant hostilities ended, every winemaking house in Champagne would rush into Russia all at once. Moët, with its connections and capital, would arrive first. The house of Clicquot would be left far behind. She needed to act ahead of the curve, to ship her champagne to Russia before it was safe or legal to do so. To risk everything, the goods, her reputation, her freedom, perhaps even her life, for a slim chance at success. In early 1814, Barbe-Nicole made her decision. She secretly chartered a merchant vessel out of a Dutch port. Holland was nominally under French control, but Dutch merchants enjoyed somewhat more freedom in maritime shipping than their French counterparts. Through a network of trusted agents, the widow Clicquot arranged for more than 10,000 bottles of champagne to be smuggled out of her cellars in Reims to Amsterdam. From there, the ship was to sail to Königsberg, then on to St. Petersburg. The operation demanded surgical precision. Bottles were packed at night to avoid attention. Wagons left Reims disguised as ordinary trade caravans. At every stage of the journey lay the risk of inspection, confiscation, arrest. Barbe-Nicole personally coordinated everything through her network of agents and couriers. She could not afford a single mistake. The ship set sail from Amsterdam in the late spring of 1814. By then, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. Paris had fallen in late March and Napoleon had abdicated in April. The war was officially over, but the chaos was only beginning. Borders remained closed, ports still blockaded. No one understood which laws now applied or who had the right to what. Into this chaos sailed the ship, carrying the widow Clicquot's champagne, threading its way toward Russian shores. Every day of delay could prove fatal. Her competitors weren't sleeping either. Jean Rare, my Moët, was preparing shipments of his own. The race was on, and the stakes could not have been higher. Barbe-Nicole deployed every resource at her disposal. Her agent in Königsberg, a man named Louis Bonnet, watched the harbor closely and reported every shift in circumstances. Another agent in St. Petersburg prepared the ground for receiving the goods, negotiating with customs officials, seeking out buyers among the aristocracy, spreading word of the imminent arrival of France's finest champagne. The widow's greatest asset was speed. Her ship sailed light, carrying no unnecessary cargo, making no stops at intermediate ports, wasting no time on side deals. Its sole purpose was to reach Russia first, and that purpose was achieved. In June 1814, the ship carrying the widow Clicquot's champagne sailed into the port of St. Petersburg. Her competitors were weeks behind. By the time vessels from the other champagne houses finally reached Russia, the market was already taken. Russian aristocrats had tasted the crystal, clear champagne of the widow Clicquot and wanted nothing else. But the victory was not yet complete. Barbe-Nicole had risked more than mere money. She had risked everything. Had the ship sunk or been seized, she would have lost her entire stock and been left with crushing debt. Had the authorities discovered the smuggling operation, she would have faced trial. She had staked her future on a single roll of the dice and won. This gamble revealed what set the widow Clicquot apart from most of her contemporaries. She could see opportunity where others saw only obstacles. She was willing to act while others chose to wait, and she possessed nerves of steel, allowing her to remain calm in situations that would have sent anyone else into a panic. But the smuggled shipment was only the opening move in a much larger game. To cement her success, she needed to turn a stroke of luck into a system, a temporary advantage into lasting dominance. And fate handed the widow Clicquot an opportunity she would seize with the brilliance of a born marketer. That opportunity arrived in the form of Russian officers marching through the streets of her native Reims. In March 1814, the streets of Reims are filled with foreign soldiers, Russians, Austrians, Prussians. The armies of the coalition have entered France and are advancing on Paris. For the people of Champagne, it is a catastrophe. The occupiers demand provisions, seize horses, billet themselves in homes without so much as asking. A war that had raged somewhere far away for so many years has arrived on their doorstep. Russian officers quickly discovered the region's greatest treasure, the wine cellars. They broke into the vaults, uncorked bottles, staged feasts. Winemakers watched in horror, tallying their losses, years of labor, thousands of bottles of aged wine vanishing down the throats of invaders in a matter of days. Many tried to hide their stock, bricking up cellar entrances, bribing officers to look elsewhere. Barbe-Nicole Clicquot did the opposite. When Russian soldiers arrived at her cellars, she ordered the doors thrown wide open. Let them drink, let them take whatever they wanted. Her managers were stunned. This was ruin. But the widow only smiled and repeated a phrase that would go down in history. Let them drink now, tomorrow. They'll pay for it. Those words were not the resignation of the defeated. They were the calculation of a victor. Barbe-Nicole understood something others did not. Russian officers weren't merely soldiers. They were aristocrats, men of wealth and influence. Back home, they would set the fashion in St. Petersburg's salons. They would tell stories of their adventures in France, of the wines they had tasted there. If they liked this champagne, they would want to drink it at home too. They would create demand, free of charge, with nothing but their own tongues. The calculation proved flawless. The Russians tasted the crystal, clear champagne of the widow and were astonished. It was worlds apart from the cloudy liquid they'd known before. It shone in their glasses, foamed with flawless bubbles, caressed the palate. The officers committed the name to memory, Veuve Clicquot. The widow Clicquot, a strange name for a wine, a woman's name. It was intriguing and it stuck. Meanwhile, Barbe-Nicole's smuggled ship was already approaching the shores of Russia. The timing was perfect. Russian troops were still stationed in France when the first bottles appeared in the shops of St. Petersburg. Rumors spread faster than the merchants could restock their shelves. It's the very wine we drank in Reims. The one we couldn't stop drinking. Demand exploded overnight. Barbe-Nicole's agent in St. Petersburg, having received the shipment, followed a careful plan. He did not sell the champagne wholesale to the first merchant who came along. He sought entry into high society instead. The first bottles went not to shops, but to the salons of the aristocracy. This was a seed meant to yield a rich harvest. When a prince served an unfamiliar wine at a reception, his guests would ask its name, and upon learning it was that very champagne from Champagne, they too would want the same. The strategy worked brilliantly. By the summer of 1814, the widow Clicquot's champagne had become the fashionable drink of St. Petersburg's elite. Orders poured into Reims one after another. Barbe-Nicole could barely keep up with shipping new batches. Her competitors, arriving weeks late, found the market already claimed. Their own wine selling reluctantly. Why buy it when Clicquot was already there? The Russian Emperor Alexander played a particularly important role in this success. The sovereign who had defeated Napoleon set the tone for the entire empire. His tastes became the standard for the court and, through the court, for high society at large. The widow Clicquot's champagne appeared on the imperial table and received the unofficial blessing of the most powerful man in Russia. No better advertisement could be imagined. The success in Russia exceeded even Barbe-Nicole's own expectations. Where the house of Clicquot had once sold a few thousand bottles a year, it now counted its sales in the tens of thousands. Money began flowing in. The debts accumulated over years of war were paid off within months. For the first time in years, the widow could breathe freely. Her business had not merely survived, it had taken flight. But what proved most remarkable was the image her champagne acquired in the Russian imagination. Veuve Clicquot became more than just a wine, it became a symbol of victory. The Russians drank it to celebrate Napoleon's defeat. They bound this drink to the most glorious moment in their history. That emotional bond proved stronger than any contract. Alexander Pushkin mentions Clicquot's champagne in Eugene Onegin alongside the wine of A as a fixture of high society and hussar life in his era, and the 1811 vintage, which we'll return to shortly, went down in history under its own special name, the Comet wine. It was an extraordinary vintage, and Barbe-Nicole made brilliant use of the celestial event for marketing purposes. Above all, what the widow Clicquot achieved through her Russian gamble was the creation of a legend. She turned her name into a brand recognized far beyond the borders of France. She proved that a woman could run a business not just as well as men, but better. She showed that daring and calculation, combined, could yield results unattainable through caution alone. By 1815, the House of Clicquot had risen to second place among champagne producers, trailing only the House of Maude. But the gap was closing fast. The quality of Clicquot's wine was incomparably higher, thanks to the remouage technique that competitors still hadn't figured out. Her marketing triumph in Russia opened doors to other markets. Prussian, Austrian, even British buyers wanted to taste the wine the Russian Tsar himself was drinking. Barbe-Nicole stood on the threshold of a real triumph. She was 38 years old. Behind her lay years of struggle, risk, and despair. Ahead lay prospects she would not have dared imagine even in her most optimistic moments. But the widow Clicquot had no intention of stopping there. She was already planning her next move, creating a visual identity that would make her bottles instantly recognizable among thousands of competitors. The year of the Great Comet had given her an idea she would carry out with the skill of a born marketer. The year 1811 went down in the history of winemaking as the year of the Great Comet. That spring, a celestial body appeared in the skies over Europe, visible to the naked eye for several months. The comet blazed so brightly it could be seen even in daylight. People looked up at the sky with a mixture of dread and hope. Some saw the comet as an omen of disaster, others as a sign of divine favor. No one remained indifferent. For the winemakers of Champagne, that summer proved exceptional. The weather was ideal: warm days, cool nights, enough rain early in the season, and a dry, sunny autumn for the grapes to ripen. The fruit reached an unprecedented sweetness and aroma. Old-timers could not recall a more fortunate year, and naturally, people connected this abundance to the heavenly sign. The comet had blessed the harvest, so said the farmers, the priests, the merchants. This year's wine would be something special. Barbe-Nicole Clicquot saw in all this not superstition, but opportunity. She understood how the human mind worked. People want to believe in miracles, and they're willing to pay more for things wrapped in an aura of mystery and exclusivity. The Comet offered a ready-made story for selling wine, a story she didn't need to invent, only to package correctly. The champagne of the 1811 harvest was named Comet wine, Vin de la Comté in French. Barbe-Nicole didn't merely give a batch of wine a pretty name, she created a legend. Her agents in Russia, Prussia, and England told their clients tales of the miraculous harvest, of the celestial omen, of a wine said to bring good fortune to its owner. The rational 19th century embraced this romantic fable eagerly. Comet wine became a sensation. Demand exceeded every expectation, prices soared. Bottles from the 1811 vintage became collector's items even within the lifetimes of the people who had made them. It was a marketing triumph rooted in a shrewd understanding of human psychology. Barbe-Nicole wasn't selling a mere beverage, she was selling a share in a miracle. But the widow Clicquot understood that one lucky story could not sustain a lasting brand. Comets appear only once every few decades. What was needed was a permanent visual signature, an anchor for the eye that would let buyers recognize a Clicquot bottle among hundreds of competitors. At a time when most champagne houses used modest, nearly indistinguishable labels, this was a revolutionary idea. The choice Barbe-Nicole made seems obvious today, but in the early 19th century, it required real boldness. She chose yellow. Not a dignified burgundy, not a somber black, not an elegant gold, but a bright, almost garish yellow. The color of the sun, the color of wealth, a color impossible to overlook on the dark shelves of a wine cellar. The Veuve Clicquot label became the house's calling card. A yellow rectangle with black lettering caught the eye instantly. A customer who had tasted this champagne once would remember the color and look for it the next time. No confusion, no doubt. The yellow label meant a quality that could be trusted. This principle, instant visual recognition, was decades ahead of its time. Barbe-Nicole intuitively grasped laws of branding that theorists of marketing would not formally articulate until the 20th century. She understood that in a world flooded with choices, victory belongs to whoever is easiest to remember and find. But the color of the label was only one piece of a much larger strategy. Barbe-Nicole worked to build a complete image around her champagne. This was to be a drink for winners, for people celebrating triumph. It was no accident that her wine had become so beloved among the Russian officers who had crushed Napoleon. It was no accident that it appeared on the tables of the most significant celebrations. Clicquot champagne became associated with success, with overcoming adversity, with the joy of a hard-earned victory. Barbe-Nicole reinforced this association through every means at her disposal. She made sure her wine was served at important receptions. She worked to ensure that aristocrats mentioned Veuve Clicquot in their correspondence. She cultivated an image of exclusivity. This champagne was not for everyone. It was for those who could afford the very best. Paradoxically, this strategy of scarcity only increased demand. People wanted to belong to the chosen circle. By the 1820s, the Veuve Clicquot brand had secured a firm place among the world's elite winemakers. Yellow bottles appeared on the tables of royal courts across Europe. American merchants ordered it for their wealthy clients in New York and Boston. British aristocrats, setting aside old wartime grudges against France, filled the cellars of their country estates with the widow's champagne. By this time, Barbe-Nicole herself had ceased to be merely a successful businesswoman. She had become a legend. They called her the Grande Dame of Champagne, an honorary title bestowed by no official committee, yet recognized by everyone. She stood as living proof that a woman could succeed in a world built by men, for men. But the road to the top had not been strewn with roses. The success of Veuve Clicquot attracted not only admiring customers, but envious rivals as well. The secret of remuage, which the widow had guarded so carefully, was growing harder to keep. Counterfeits of her wine flooded the markets. Ahead of her lay new battles, for quality, for her good name, for the right to be called the best, and she was ready to fight them. Fame is a double-edged blade. The reputation of Veuve Clicquot thundered across Europe, but along with admiration came predators. By the early 1820s, Barbe-Nicole faced enemies that could not be defeated by daring or winemaking talent alone. Their names were counterfeiting, espionage, and betrayal. The first blow came from the forgers. As soon as the yellow label became a symbol of quality, unscrupulous merchants began copying it. In the ports of Hamburg, Amsterdam, and London, bottles appeared bearing the name Veuve Clicquot, filled inside with cheap sparkling wine of dubious origin. Buyers, deceived by the familiar color, paid full price for counterfeit goods. Disappointed, they never returned to the brand, believing its quality had declined. Barbe-Nicole took the counterfeiting as a personal insult. Her name, the name of a widow, which she carried with pride, was being used by swindlers to deceive people. She launched a genuine war against the forgeries. Agents of the House of Clicquot combed the markets of Europe, tracking down fake bottles. The widow hired lawyers, filed lawsuits, pushed for the confiscation of counterfeit goods. It was an exhausting, costly battle with no end in sight. The court cases dragged on slowly, while the counterfeits multiplied quickly. Barbe-Nicole realized she needed a different approach, not merely reacting to fakes, but making them impossible to produce. She made the label design more complex, adding elements that were difficult to reproduce by crude, makeshift methods. She introduced a batch numbering system that allowed each bottle's origin to be traced. She required her agents to buy wine only from verified suppliers and to report any suspicious offers immediately. The second front was the battle against industrial espionage. The secret of remuage, which the widow had guarded for nearly 2 decades, remained the House of Clicquot's chief competitive advantage. But with each passing year, keeping its secret grew harder. Competitors offered enormous sums to Clicquot's workers in exchange for information, planted people posing as hired laborers, bribed suppliers and couriers, anyone who might know even a fragment about the mysterious perforated tables in the cellars of Reims. John Rae-Maimogt, head of the leading rival house, made no secret of his interest in Clicquot's methods. His own champagne remained somewhat cloudy, and this irritated a man accustomed to being first. Mogt was a close friend of Napoleon's, and his wine was served at the imperial court. But even imperial patronage could not make up for his technical shortfall. Buyers increasingly chose the crystal, clear Clicquot over the murkier Mogt. Whether June Rae-Maimogt actually sent spies into Barbe-Nicole's cellars, or whether the information simply leaked out some other way, remains unknown. But the fact stands: by the mid-1820s, the technology of remuage had ceased to be a secret. One after another, the houses of Champagne began installing pupilers in their own cellars. The era of Clicquot's monopoly on clear champagne was drawing to a close. For many entrepreneurs, losing a unique advantage would have spelled disaster. Barbe-Nicole treated it as a challenge. If everyone could now make clear wine, then she would make the best clear wine. She doubled down on quality at every stage of production. She personally oversaw the selection of grapes, demanding that suppliers meet the strictest standards. She spent hours in the cellars, tasting samples from different batches, rejecting anything that fell short of her vision of perfection. The workers at the house of Clicquot knew Madame would let no flaw slip past. She would appear in the cellars at any hour of the day or night, check the Riddler's work, inspect bottles after disgorgement. Her eye caught the faintest trace of cloudiness. Her palate detected the subtlest shift in flavor. She was a living standard of quality, the benchmark every employee measured themselves against. This obsession with perfection extended to her dealings with the growers as well. Barbe-Nicole signed long-term contracts with the finest estates in Champagne, guaranteeing them steady income in exchange for exceptional quality. She dictated the terms when to harvest, how to transport the grapes, which varieties to grow on which slopes. The farmers grumbled but complied. The widow's money was good, and supplying a great house opened doors. By the 1830s, the House of Clicquot had firmly established itself as the industry leader. Competitors had mastered remuage, but none could replicate Barbe-Nicole's systematic approach to quality. Her wine remained the benchmark against which all others were measured, not because it was the only clear champagne left, but because behind it stood a woman who accepted no compromises. Barbe-Nicole was past 50 by now, but she had no thoughts of slowing down. Every morning she woke thinking of business. Every evening she fell asleep planning the next day's tasks. Her energy astonished the young managers who struggled to keep pace with her instructions. She ran her empire the way a captain steers a ship through a storm. With a firm hand, a clear head, and unshakable will, her competitors called her various names behind her back. Some admired her, others envied her. Still others despised her, but all of them recognized that the widow Clicquot was a force that could not be ignored. She had proven that victory could be won, not only through a pioneer's daring, but through a perfectionist's method. She had shown that true success is built not on a single stroke of genius, but on thousands of right decisions, made one day at a time. By the early 18th, Barbe-Nicole Clicquot was already past 60, an age at which most people of her era had long since gone to their graves, or were living out their final years in quiet obscurity. But the widow Clicquot had no intention of dying or of stepping back from her affairs. She stood at the summit of the empire she had built with her own hands, and she meant to enjoy the view from that summit. It was time to turn success into something greater, into a dynasty, a monument, a form of immortality. The symbol of her triumph was the Château de Boursault. This grand estate stood in the very heart of Champagne, among hills carpeted with vineyards. Barbe-Nicole acquired the land and began developing it in the 1830s, transforming the property into a residence worthy of a queen. She rebuilt the main house, laid out formal gardens, and created wine cellars that could rival those of any aristocratic family. The Château became more than a home. It became a declaration. Look at me, it seemed to say. I am the daughter of a cloth merchant, the widow of a winemaker who died young, a woman in a world made by men, and here I am, living as few duchesses ever do. My cellars are full of the finest wine in the world. My guests are ambassadors and ministers. My name is known from St. Petersburg to New York. I have won. But Barbe-Nicole was far too shrewd to rest on her laurels. She understood that an empire built by one person dies with that person unless a successor is prepared. She had a daughter, XIII, but the girl showed no interest in winemaking. XIII had married the Comte de Chevenix and preferred the life of a society lady to labor in the cellars. Barbe-Nicole did not press the matter. She knew all too well what it meant to pursue a calling without passion. She found her successor elsewhere. His name was Edouard Worlay. The young man had joined the house of Clicquot as a simple clerk and quickly displayed the qualities the widow prized above all: a sharp mind, a shrewd business sense, and unwavering dedication to the work. Barbe-Nicole recognized in him a younger version of herself, the same hunger for success, the same willingness to work to exhaustion, the same understanding that quality tolerates no compromise. She took Dwarf under her wing and began passing on the knowledge she had accumulated over decades. This was more than instruction in business management. It was the transmission of a philosophy, a way of thinking, a way of seeing the world. Barbe-Nicole taught him to read the market, to anticipate demand, to build relationships with clients. She shared secrets of winemaking that could not be found in any book. She was preparing a man who would carry her work forward once she was gone. In 1830, Edouard Worlay became a partner in the house of Clicquot. The company took on a new official name, Veuve Clicquot Ponsardin. It was both a recognition of the young manager's achievements and a preparation for the future. Barbe-Nicole gradually handed over more and more authority to him, though she herself remained at the helm and had no intention of relinquishing the wheel until her final breath. Life at the Château de Boursault followed a strict routine. The widow Clicquot rose at dawn, as she had for decades. She breakfasted lightly, reviewed her correspondence, issued instructions to her managers. Despite her age, she still went down to the cellars regularly to check the quality of the wine. Her presence alone kept the workers sharp. They knew Madame would notice the slightest carelessness. In the afternoons, she received visitors. Merchants from across Europe came to her, hoping to become agents of the house of Clicquot. Winemakers came seeking advice, journalists came dreaming of writing about the legendary woman, and simply the curious came, wanting to see the living legend, the Grande Dame of Champagne, with their own eyes. Barbe-Nicole received them all with the dignity of a queen, but without arrogance. She remembered where she had come from, and that made her greatness genuine. She spent her evenings with family, with her daughter, her son-in-law, her grandchildren. She loved to tell them stories from her youth, of the revolution she had lived through as a girl, of her husband Francois and the dream they had shared, of the years of struggle and risk. These were more than an old woman's reminiscences. They were lessons, a transmission of experience, the shaping of a family's memory. Barbe-Nicole wanted her descendants to understand the price that had been paid for everything they now possessed. By the 1850s, the widow Clicquot had passed 70, but she retained her clarity of mind and firmness of character. Her body grew weaker. She left the chair too less and less often, spending more and more time in her armchair by the fire. But her voice still carried authority in meetings with her managers, and her decisions still shaped the company's course. She remained the center around which the entire empire revolved. By this time, Edouard Worlay was effectively running the day-to-day affairs of the business. but he still consulted Madame on every important decision. He had learned what she wanted him to learn and had become a worthy successor. Under his leadership, the House of Clicquot continued to grow, expanding into new markets, refining its production. Barbe-Nicole watched it all with the satisfaction of a master whose student had surpassed the teacher. In her final years, the widow's thoughts turned increasingly to the past. She remembered Franz Oz, the husband she had lost so early, whose dream she had brought to life. She remembered her father, who had taught her to count money and not fear risk. She remembered the years of revolution that had forged her character. It all came together into a story she had lived day after day for nearly 90 years. The story of a woman who refused to accept the role assigned to her and wrote her own instead. On July 29, 1866, Barbe-Nicole Clicquot Ponsardin died at her Château. She was 88 years old. Until her final days, she had kept a keen interest in the company's affairs. Until her final days, she had remained the Grande Dame of Champagne. She departed, leaving behind not merely a successful business. She left behind a legend, a template, proof that the impossible was possible. Imagine for a moment a world in which Barbe-Nicole Clicquot had heeded her father-in-law's advice in 1805 and closed down the winemaking business. A world in which the 27-year-old widow had chosen safety over risk, propriety over daring, a quiet life over a great struggle. What would Champagne be like today? In all likelihood, nothing like what we know now. Without the technology of remouage, sparkling wine would have remained a cloudy beverage for decades longer, perhaps much longer. Someone else might eventually have stumbled upon a method of clarification. But when exactly, and would they have found it at all? History is full of inventions that might have appeared but never did, simply because no one emerged with the right combination of intelligence, persistence, and circumstance. Barbe-Nicole became that person for Champagne. Her invention transformed not merely a technique, but the very status of the drink itself. Before remouage, Champagne had been an exotic curiosity, a whim of the wealthy willing to tolerate its flaws for the sake of novelty. After remouage, it became a symbol of perfection, a benchmark of quality, an emblem of celebration recognized the world over. Every bottle of clear, sparkling champagne produced today, by any house, in any country, carries within it the echo of a discovery made in a cold cellar in Reims by a woman who refused to accept that cloudiness was simply how things had to be. The house of Veuve Clicquot itself endures to this day, now part of the LVMH luxury conglomerate, one of the most recognized champagne brands in the world. That distinctive yellow label, the one Barbe-Nicole chose nearly 2 centuries ago, still catches the eye on store shelves, still signals quality, still tells, in its own silent way, the story of the woman who created it. Few brands can claim a visual identity that has endured, essentially unchanged, for 200 years. Fewer still can trace that identity back to a single, deliberate decision made by their founder. But Barbe-Nicole's legacy extends far beyond one company's success. She proved something that the business world of her time was reluctant to accept: that talent, vision, and sheer determination do not recognize the boundaries of gender. In an age when women were legally barred from signing contracts, from owning property independently, from participating in most forms of commerce, she built an empire through sheer force of will, and did it not by breaking the rules quietly, but by mastering the very game the rules were meant to keep her out of. Her story offers lessons that remain relevant far beyond the world of winemaking. She showed that a crisis, the death of a husband, a business on the brink of ruin, a market closed by war, could become the foundation for something extraordinary if met with clear thinking rather than despair. She showed that genuine innovation often comes not from grand theoretical insight, but from patient hands-on observation, from watching how sediment moves in a bottle day after day until the answer reveals itself. She showed that a technical breakthrough alone is not enough. It must be paired with the vision to build a brand, to tell a story, to give people a reason to want what you have made. And perhaps most importantly, she showed that legacy is not something you inherit. It is something you build deliberately, decision by decision, over the course of a lifetime, and then pass on with the same care with which it was made. Edouard Worley carried her work forward, and the house he helped build continued to flourish long after both of them were gone, carrying the name of a widow from Reims into a third century of existence. Barbe-Nicole Clicquot began her life as a merchant's daughter in a city known for coronations, not revolutions. She became, instead, a revolutionary of her own kind, quieter than the ones that convulsed France in her youth, but no less lasting in its effects. She took a flawed, temperamental, often dangerous product and turned it into a symbol of triumph, of celebration, of everything worth toasting in a life well lived. In doing so, she raised a glass to something larger than wine, the proof that one determined woman with a leaky table and an unbreakable will could change the world one bottle at a time.